how are you going to do a strategic plan? There are three major areas that the board needs to establish, um, based on the board of directors, which is the leadership of the organization, has to establish a financial policy target. In order to do that, they need three major areas have to be decided upon. First is the growth rate in assets. Next is the debt policy, and lastly is the profitability objective. And the board of directors is a part of all of these decision making, or all of these parts of the decision process, and each of these are connected. So regarding asset growth, the first question is, how much do we want to grow our assets on the balance sheet? Do we just want to maintain the number of assets? Even maintaining assets requires you to usually over time put more assets on. Continue to keep. How are you going to keep the number of assets on your balance sheet on the balance sheet? And in addition, if you want to grow, how are you going to grow? And what does that mean for your revenue line? If you want to increase, think about a hospital. If you want to increase your revenue, by 10% between year 2015 and 2016, how are you going to do that? Are you you're going to probably have to see more patients. Well, how are you going to see more patients? You're going to have to hire some new physicians that can increase bill, that can bill for those new patients. Well, in order to do that, you're going to have to grow your assets, because that physician, they're going to be on your balance sheet, in your future paid, um, paid, in the future payment of, of the physician salaries. And so again, all of this relationship between the assets and the income statement is really critical that you understand and are comfortable with that. But if you're going to grow your revenue, in order to meet your revenue, you're going to have to grow your assets, because its assets are what produce revenue. And so, in order to do that, you have to make the decision. And it's this, the people go back and forth on this all the time. Sometimes, a part of the parent organization says, hey, you can't have that much asset growth, and you aren't allowed, and then therefore you can't increase your revenue by a certain percent, or you're gonna have to do it in a different way that, where you utilize your assets more effectively versus actually growing them. Key financial policy target that you have to establish is your debt policy. So, in order to grow your assets, if you think back to that equation, assets equals liability plus equity. In order to grow your assets, you're going to have to increase the other side of the balance sheet, so the liabilities and your equity. And the question is how much is the board comfortable in financing, the asset growth with debt? Are you kind of over leveraged already and you're not comfortable with financing it with debt, or you don't think a bank will give you the debt? So that, you have only the leadership can answer this question, and it's based on what they're comfortable with, and the CFO will be part of making that decision. And the answer really depends on how leveraged a firm will allow themselves to be in the future. The next key financial policy target, and the third one, is the profitability objectives. So the next question is, okay, if you want to grow your assets by a certain amount, and you said we can fund a certain percentage of that with debt, and that's what your board is comfortable with, the rest is going to have to come from equity. You're going to have to fund those assets somehow. And the question is how is the firm going to generate that equity? Can it raise the equity? Is it going to reinvest all of its net income back into the equity side of the balance sheet? Are you going to go and find more people to invest in your company, and have equity, increase the number of shareholders? How are you going to fund that equity? Where is it going to come from? And then as a result, that impacts your return on equity. And so if you can't define what you want your profitability objective is, you can't decide if you're okay with your equity strategy to fund the assets that you want to bring on. And Again, return on equity is often the primary measure of financial performance as a result of the fact that, in order to grow a business, it's going, you probably are going to have to grow your equity part of the balance sheet a little bit. And that's going to change the return on equity because of the formula that's involved, because you're changing part of the numerator and the denominator. This figure is in the book also. I know I usually don't put a lot of figures in from the textbook in my slides, but I actually really like this one. And this really illustrates the how in the financial planning process you have these relationships. So again, if we go back to the first step, is to decide, what's your asset growth rate going to be. So in the income statement, if you currently have $1,000 of revenue, and in 5 years later you want to be at $2,000 in revenue, you're going to have to grow your balance sheet by an additional $1,000 in order to meet that revenue target in the future. So in 5 years, your balance sheet is going to have to be, instead of having $1,000 of assets on your balance sheet, you're going to need $2,000 of assets on your balance sheet. And what this means is you're going to have to fund that $1,000. So the difference between 1,000 and 2,000 is 1,000. You're going to have to fund that $1,000 through a combination of debt and equity. And if you look down, so based on their debt policy, the organization decided that 50% of it, so $500, can be funded through debt, and $500 can be funded through equity. And these were all the financial policies that had to, these decisions had to be made about how you were going to fund the growth revenue based on the balance sheet and what you were comfortable with. Again, the balance sheet is used to describe key financial policy targets. A financial plan can be considered as a bridge between the current balance sheet and the balance sheet of some future date. So depending on what you're doing your plan for, is it 5 years from now, is it 2 years, etc. The growth rate refers to the growth rate in assets. Your debt capacity is a change in the current and long-term liabilities that you need to bring on, and how much can you increase the amount of debt that you have, so that long-term liability, in order to meet your growth rate target and assets. And then lastly, the profitability objective goes back to the change in equity, and what is that going to do to the return on equity that you target, that you have as an organization. So the book outlines 10 requirements for effective financial policy making. To be honest, I've gone over these in the past with students, but I don't really find a lot of value, and so you don't need to be concerned with this slide. But in general, you don't need to know for an exam, but in general, you need to just kind of understand that you need a good accounting system. So you need a good general ledger, which is usually a health IT, a IT system. Understand that no growth doesn't necessarily imply zero growth. So assets run off the books. They expire, or they get paid down. They run down in value. And so just because you don't want to see a growth rate in your revenue doesn't mean that you don't need to have a strategy to replace the assets that are running off. Working capital needs need to be considered. So what do you just need in general on a short-term basis for capital? Funds for future investment are critical. You need a formally defined debt capacity ceiling. So what's the absolute max capacity for debt that you're allowed to have, and that needs to be defined by the organization. Program selection for criteria for return on investment. So what's the return on investment criteria that the organization always has to follow? There should always be non-operating sources of equity included in the decision making. So again, these are the forms of, these are things that relate to the non-operating parts of the organization. So, things that are not related back to patient services. The financial plan must be integrated with management control systems. Financial plans should be updated at least annually, and financial plans should be formally approved by the board. So the next part is, how do we do a strategic plan? And there are 4 steps. Um, so, these are important to know. The first part is to assess the financial position of the prior growth pattern. So you need to know where you've been in the past. You need to know what's been going on in the organization. You need to know, how profitable you've been. So all of those ratios that you learned about in the lecture before the midterm, you need to know how your organization is performing with regard to those and what the trends are showing. Are you showing that your profitability is going down? Are you showing that your days cash on hand is getting bigger or smaller? And based on those trends, you need to be able to make decisions about the future. You can't decide where you're going in the future if you don't know where you've been in the past. If you've constantly been struggling with short-term liquidity, you can't make a decision in the future that's going to put that liquidity at risk, because it's just not smart for the organization. You're going to put people, you're going to take unnecessary risks that you really don't need to and shouldn't be doing it. It's not a smart decision. So the first part is to assess the present financial position. And like I just talked about, assess the present financial position. So you generally want to review the 3 to 5 years, and you want to know the last probably 2 years in very, very detailed, quarter over quarter changes. You want to perform financial evaluations using the ratio analysis. So you want to look at profitability. You want to understand the cash and liquidity position. You need to understand your organization's ability to be considered for long-term debt financing. So do banks consider you guys risky? What if people told you are issues in the past when you've gone to a bank and requested to borrow money? Do you need to update the plant and equipment? So the current assets that you have on the book, are they kind of aging out? That goes back to the average age of your plant. Are things getting old? Are you going to have to make just investments to keep to keep you guys operating at where you are, or can you kind of consider everything safe? And then also, what are the investment reserves situation? Is that you need to define your growth rate and assets. So, based on a 5-year plan, it is impossible to forecast asset investment without first forecasting revenues and also expenses. So revenue forecasting is an absolute integral part of asset forecasting, because the level of services that you need to be able to meet that revenue target must also, requires an underlying required investment that's going to come in the form of assets. So, for example, if you grow your property, plant, and equipment, that is going to generally impact the level of services and the range of services to be expected provided during a planning process. This is really kind of where a lot of the big operational decision making conversations happen when you're thinking strategically. This is when someone says, I want to grow the number of patients, where the number of I'm trying to think off the top of my head. If you're in a hospital and someone says, I want to grow our stroke capabilities, and I want to see 20% more stroke patients a year and become the stroke care center in the city that we live in, and the place that everyone comes within a 200-mile radius for stroke care. Well, in order to do that, they're going to have to grow their assets. They're probably going to need some equipment, and they're going to need more doctors to do that. And how are you going to make those decisions? You're going to evaluate, okay, is there the demand for those services out there? Is the market demanding this? Are there people that want this service out there? Would we have patients? Do we expect that strokes are going to increase in our area? Or is it not that we expect that strokes are going to increase, but that the other health system across town that was providing this care is no longer able to provide this care, and we want to come into the market and fill this gap? What is the overall strategic thinking behind this decision? And that really filters into, that connection between those processes happens during that. So the next Again, and as part of this defining your growth rate and your assets, you're going to project your revenues, your expenses, your non-operating gains, and then from there you'll project your assets. Is to define the debt policy. So you're going to look at your current liabilities and then also your long-term debt. So in general, your board members are going to tell you, what percentage of your balance sheet can be funded through debt. And debt should be viewed as the balancing variable in financial planning. So this means that in a financial plan, you should not project assets and equity and then balance the equation with debt. So sound financial policy requires that the board manages and defines in advance their position regarding the assumptions of debt. So the board needs to have a policy in general saying, we will never fund ourselves with more than, say, 60% debt, whatever it is, 60%, 80%, 50%, whatever that number is, and then you should define based on that what your long-term debt position is going to be. It shouldn't be the other way around, where the part of where the finance team is coming to them saying, hey, we want to grow the business in these areas. Hey, can we finance it with 80% debt? There should already be a policy in place that says this is what our debt policy is, and here's the percentage of our book that can be balanced, that can be paid for through debt. You need to remember that your current liabilities includes your accrued salaries and wages. So over time, those are going to run down as you pay people every month as you pay people their salaries and wages. And you need to also expect, though, that your salary and wages are going to increase year over year because there's some, it's usually a cost of living adjustment each year, and so people's salaries are not going to stay the same. They're going to grow just by the nature of them staying employed with you, and so you're going to have to increase that rate also. Is to assess the reasonableness of the required equity growth rate. So can you actually achieve the results that you're currently projecting, or are these assumptions realistic? Can you actually do what you're talking about doing? And oftentimes, organizations bite off more than they can chew, and they have these grand plans, and the reality is they can't actually do it. And this is the part where you have to say, is this realistic? Can we actually do this? Is it realistic that our organization plan for this type of growth? Or, the reality is we're not going to see that percentage of growth. It's just unrealistic. Some people say that growth rate should, growth of a solid and stable organization that is not seeing a drastic increase in demand should really grow at the same rate that GDP grows, and that's considered consistent and safe. Too much growth at one time can be dangerous for an organization. It can throw them into turbulence and create unrealistic expectations for leadership and so forth. And so you don't want to be growing too fast, but you also don't want to be growing too slow. And then finally, you have to integrate that into the management control process for continuous evaluation. So you have to, once you've decided and you've said, okay, everything we projected we think we can do, you have to implement that into your management practices, and you have to start doing it.